I sometimes wonder what really defines historical political times. I came to KU, enrolled in KU in 1969, and it was in the midst of the Vietnam War and all the problems and hassles and great, cultural upheaval that we were going through there. And now I look at the last few years and I wonder how they really compare. I mean, Brownback has just driven us into a ditch with his plan to just scrap our income tax, which was a third of revenues to our state. And now we have President Trump in the White House. I mean, good heavens. And Trump wants to borrow much of Brownback's tax package, is what they're thinking about for a national tax plan at this point. Because my next question, is everybody ready for Governor Kobach next year to... Well, the legislature, they have to do a couple things, which are their primary functions, and then there are the secondary issues that they spend a lot of time on. They have to pass a budget, and they have to pass a budget that does not contain a deficit. Now, we play some games, and as you think back of some of the comments off this tape, we've used bonding incredibly for highways and to renovate our capital and a number of things. So we're building and passing debt on for 20, 30 years. We're using debt to dredge John Redmond Reservoir so we can keep Wolf Creek running. So you wonder how that counts against a balanced state annual budget, but that's another thing. And as this presentation showed, we've run through most of the tricks and most of the borrowing and taking, one-time money. And so we had a structural deficit facing us. And this new legislature stepped up to the task to say, we've got to reverse course and we've got to rebuild a revenue base at this point. So to get a budget passed and get it semi in balance, you had to deal with passing the tax package, which they did. The other thing that was on the must-do list was brought to us by the Kansas Supreme Court that looked at our 2-year block grant, school funding block grant we've had, and declared it unconstitutional. And basically said, you have to come up with a constitutional plan by July 1 or no money will be let out for public schools starting July 1st. So that was a mandate that this legislature couldn't avoid, and then they had to deal with it at this point. So talking about the tax package that did pass, it was in 1994 that Kansas really rebalanced our taxes statewide. Up to that point, we had been much too dependent on property taxes for funding schools and people understood that, and they saw the disparity between poor wealth districts and rich wealth districts and how that was an unequal school funding problem. So around that, they built a new tax package with, Finney started it, Bill Graves really completed it. And the ideal was to get to a third sales tax, a third property tax, and a third income tax. It was the three-legged stool that we would have a balance in our state. That one source, sales tax get hit during a recession, income tax is not as much. There's a resilience to what that tax package would be. We never quite got there, but we got pretty close. So Brownback gets elected in 2010, and his great idea is that there are 10 states in our country that doesn't have an income tax, so why does Kansas have to have an income tax? Of course, you forget things like, Wyoming has coal, and Texas has oil, and Florida has tourism, and there are other sources of revenue that came to those states that really didn't balance for Kansas. So off we went. So in the ensuing years, in this experiment, we've gone through 9 rounds of budget cuts. We've had all sorts of the transfers that were mentioned in this presentation, more debt bonding. So we pass over the governor's veto a second time, a new income tax level. It probably restores maybe 80% of what our income taxes were in 2010 before we started making the changes. 2/3 of the tax loss that Brownback put on us was from changing brackets. So we went from 3 brackets to 2 brackets, and we lowered the top rate that our wealthiest thing were paying. So 70% of those tax bracket changes went to the top 10% of filers in our state. So that was 2/3 of it. The other third was this LLC loophole for 333,000 sole proprietorships, subchapter S's, et cetera. That was a brand new experiment. No state had ever done that in our country, to just drop that, and that was automatic. The income brackets were going to come down over a period of time, but we dropped that. When we finally got, first of all, they thought it was going to be 191,000 filers. It ended up at 333,000 filers. And when we finally got some numbers on who was benefiting from that change, 85% of those that tax savings went to 5% of our filers, the million and up. So we have a new tax law. We're going to bring back deductions for medical expenses and mortgage interest, property taxes, child care and adult care expenses. They're not going to be reintroduced back in to our tax package. And for all the specific details you want to know about that, I'll ask Marcy to get into the nuances, since she sat on the Senate Taxation Committee this year and monitored all this a lot closer than I did. Estimates are that for 2018, we're going to get about $591 million new dollars out of the tax package, and for 2019, it's $631 million. Most people think we lost about $900 million in it from the basic income tax changes that Brownback made. We got no reduction in our sales tax at this point, and that was hiked a percent to help pay for the income taxes thing. We're one of a few states that tax groceries at this point, and we're only second to Mississippi in having the highest sales tax on food in the country. I don't know if that's our model, if we're headed to Mississippi or, at this point. So we have the tax thing passed, so they had to do that so that then we could pass a 2-year budget. And Brownback was the first governor to come in and offer 2-year budgets. Always in the past, it was an annual 1-year budget, and each legislative session would review it and talk about it and fine-tune it. The governor wanted 2 years to talk about this and work, maybe give them more space for other debate in the second year. And as a lobbyist and somebody who watches this, I'm still waiting for that change. I'm wondering, when are we going to take next year? Now, we've already passed a budget for 2019. Are the Ways and Means subcommittees, are the House budget committees, are they now, since the budget's set for 2019, are they going to sit down and go over specifics? What about our water plan? What about foster care? What about child support? Take an issue and really delve into it, because they have extra time this next session. We'll see if it ever plays out that way at this point. In many ways, the state budget is not particularly complicated. 50% of our state budget is K through 12 spending. And I'll get into the school package in a little bit. But just a couple numbers to kind of highlight what we're trying to do to catch up with that. In 2009, our base state aid per pupil was $4,400. Today, our base state aid per pupil is $3,852, about $600 less. The new school package that just passed takes us from $3,852 to $44,006 in 2018 and $4,128 in 2019. So we don't come anywhere close to $4,400 that we were at in 2008. And that doesn't do anything about inflation. What should that $4,400 be, to make up for that? So that's K through 12. The next 20% really comes for social services. And the vast amount of social services that we spend money on in Kansas is our Medicaid program that we call CanCare at this point. The one thing the legislature did do is pass they increased the fees for medical providers in Kansas. And then these increased fees then can be used to draw down more federal Medicaid dollars. So last year, to get out of the mess we had with the budget, we cut Medicaid providers by 4%. And this increase in fees is going to at least make up for that 4% cut. I could spend more time on some of the other social service issues. We have a record number of kids in foster care at this point, about 7,600 kids. They passed to finally they're going to develop a new task force to look at how our foster care system's doing. We were the first state in the country in 1997 to privatize totally our foster care system. And I think it's real hard for anybody to say that we've made vast improvements going in that direction. I would say a sidelight to that is many of you are familiar with the temporary assistance for needy families, which is our basic public assistance program in Kansas. When Brownback started, we had 38,000 people on that program. Today we have 13,000. And out of the 25,000 people that have lost TANF services, 2/3 of those are children. And I think the logical connection is, we dropped that many kids off TANF, how many of those bled into the foster care system at this point? We could do that. We could check Social Security numbers at this point. The other social service area that I'll come back to in questions is child support. Kansas decided that we were going to be the first in the country to basically privatize our child support system. And we're finally starting to get a little numbers. Current monthly child support collections in Kansas is at 54%. So only 50% of current monthly support is being paid. The national average is 65%. And child support is so vital, it touches 233,000 Kansas children, which is roughly 1/3 of the children in our state are caught up in the child support system. The next on the list is higher education, and I don't need to come to Lawrence to talk about what's happened to KU and spending on that. We've basically lost 25 to 30% of state support for higher education and recouped a lot of it in higher tuition at this point. KU and K-State got a little bit help this session because they were cut even more than the other Regents universities were last year, so that. The other 15% of our budget goes for a lot of things, but a few of them, Osawatomie is just in desperate straits at this point. We can't get it recertified by the federal Medicare folks. We're losing $1 million a month at that point. Staffing 1/3 of the positions at Osawatomie are vacant. I mean, it's a mess. And when you have no money and no way to fix these problems, then it continues to steamroll. Another issue that's getting a little play that we're going to see over this summer is, are we going to bring some new entity in to build a new prison at Lansing? Lansing's our largest prison in Kansas. It was built in the 1870s, not long after Abe Lincoln at this point, and it's in pretty desperate straits. And the question is, can we bring an entity in to build it and we lease it from it for a period of time, and then does Kansas take ownership after that? And that's another issue I'm sure Marcy could fill in at this point. The other social service debate that went on that wasn't successful was expanding the Medicaid program in Kansas. They got it through the legislature, and once again, it was vetoed by the governor. It would pick up between 150 and 180,000 Kansans who are uninsured at this point, and it would bring desperate relief to a lot of the hospitals in our state. We have about 90 of them, and the estimates are that 30 of them are in pretty serious financial straits at this point, with 2 or 3 about ready to close in any week. School funding formula. So we're going to see what the Kansas Supreme Court has to say about that. The bill that the legislature passed is sitting on the governor's desk. Would he veto it? It seems unlikely. Most political observers don't think that the governor will do that. But But as soon as it's signed, then sometime next week, there'll be a hearing before the Kansas Supreme Court to see how close Kansas came to fixing this mess and getting a constitutional system in place. I think, and basically what we did is we reversed course, threw out the block grant, took the old school funding formula and tweaked it in some specific ways. The Supreme Court is particularly interested in the fact that 25% of our public schools, 25% of the public students are underperforming, seriously underperforming. And so the Supreme Court wanted a better focus out of a new school funding formula to help with that 25%. So that's kind of the equity question. And I think most people, believe that they've solved that problem, that there's enough focus on at-risk funding and to help, and the state board is going to identify particular programs that will help with at-risk programs, that the money will really go to the kids who are there. The other question is adequacy. And I gave you the numbers before, 4,400, 3,852, we only get back to 4,000, 4,100, we got a ways to go. Our State Board of Education, elected body, in our state, came in at the first of the session and said, how much money do we need in 2 years to make up the problems we've had over the last several years? Their number was $885 million. This bill that was passed, that's sitting on the governor's desk, is $300 million. So is that enough? Will the court look and say, well, you're trying hard, 18, it's a start. You're going to be back next January. Maybe you can up that a little more. We're going to see what the court has to say about it. Last thing I would say is that there is some expansion of using state dollars for private schools. And in the school funding block grant bill that was passed, they allowed corporations to get a tax break to send kids to a parochial school or a home school. And the vast amount of it went to Catholic schools in the state. This bill opens it up from not just corporations, but individuals can ask for tax credits for making a contribution. It's capped at $10 million. And I think over the last couple years, it's been used at about 2 million of the 10 million. Once again, if we get into more of the details than that, we'll have Marcy sort all that out. I want to go on to some other issues that I think are pretty important, and unfortunately, as this advocate, I don't see debated very much, and I'm wondering how we can get it refocused. Top on my list would be affordable housing in the state of Kansas. That affects seniors, the mentally ill, renters, we don't have a discussion really on what's happening with affordable housing. Under Bill Graves, he had a top level task force of cabinet members that really looked at all this. And Kansas really compiled detailed numbers by county. How many disabled units do you need? How many elderly? How many, it was very great data that we don't do anymore at this point. We don't have a successful first-time home buyer loan program that the federal government helps out with bonding to do it. We run it through counties. I know this is a little getting into the weeds too much, but basically we don't have a thrust from Topeka to really help with first-time home buyer loans. We have 1.2 million housing units in the state of Kansas. 2/3 are owner-occupied, 1/3 are rentals. So we have about 400,000 rental units in Kansas, and 40% of our renters pay over 35 up to 70% of their income for housing. They're extremely cost burdened. And we need a discussion about that. The Kansas Health Institute did an analysis in November of 2015 and basically said that 1 out of 6 Kansas households are food insecure in our state. that we have 1 out of 6 of our households, people have questions whether they have enough food at the end of the month. And the connection we've never really made is what are these housing costs doing to the problem for people to be able to feed themselves. I want to talk about utilities here a little bit. I think we're really at a crossroads in a kind of fundamental way what's going to happen with utilities. And most of this is happening before our Kansas Corporation Commission, which is the entity that regulates our investor-owned utilities, the large ones, the KCP&L, the Westars, the Kansas Gas Services, the major players that provide utilities. They've got 3 dockets before them, and we're going to see kind of the results of that and what that does for future energy policy. First docket is Kansas City Power and Light, which is owned by Great Plains Energy, wants to buy Westar, our largest electric utility. They held hearings on it. The Corporation Commission looked at it and said it's too expensive, and it wouldn't be good for ratepayers. Well, Westar wants to sell. And when I talk to journalists and people about it, a lot of them say there are a lot of executives at Westar who want to unload their stock, and they want to get out of the game. So the question is, who's going to buy Westar going forward? Will KCP&L come back in with another bid? Here's my radical approach. Why do we need an investor-owned? Why should our largest electric utility be investor-owned in Kansas? If you go to our socialist neighbor to the north called Nebraska, they do not have an investor-owned utility in their whole state. So we've got 29 rural electric co-ops. We've got some large municipals like the BPU in Kansas City, Kansas that has 120,000 customers. Why can't our RECs and municipals get together and buy Westar? And why does 8 to 10% of the profits of a major investor-owned utility like Westar have to go to Boston or to New York or to London or wherever? Why can't we keep that money here? Second docket that's probably as important is what's going to happen with energy efficiency in the state of Kansas. Kansas has been 45th of the 50 states of having conservation programs available, either utility run or government run. We've been almost dead last in that. Kansas City Power and Light passed a bill 2 years ago to tell the Corporation Commission we want to bring some of these conservation programs to Kansas. Now the question is, how do we get paid for it? And really what it comes down to is we're all in this together. I mean, you're captive customers of the utility that you have to buy from. So if Kansas City Power and Light wants to run energy conservation programs in Kansas, should only the customers that get insulated or get a new appliances or that, should they be the only ones that are paying for it? Or since we're all in it together, why don't we figure out a way, because it's the cheapest option to provide electricity is saving it than it is with a coal or wind or any other choice. So that docket is before the KCC and whether they're going to come up with a way to rate base it and assess all customers for some of these programs and how that's going to work. And, is KCP&L pissed off at the Corporation Commission getting turned down for buying Westar? Are they going to back off? The third important data or docket is really what they call distributed energy. And it gets down to a question of solar and wind systems. And Cromwell and every people, the push is really on to add solar panels to more and more homes to figure out ways to finance it. Margaret knows that as well as anybody. So the question for the Corporation Commission is, I have a solar panel on my house, and I don't have battery backups, and I'm using the electric grid behind me as my battery backup. What is a fair monthly charge for that service? And then secondly, probably, which gets maybe more, needs to be debated, is the solar panels produce electricity at the peak time for our electric utilities. We're a summer peaking electric state. Our greatest demand, and it's primarily driven by air conditioning, and solar panels really meet that demand almost perfectly. So then the question is, if I'm generating more power off my solar panels at the heat of the day and sending it back to Westar or whoever, what's a fair price for me to get for that power? What the utilities want to do is you pay retail, 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. They want to pay you wholesale, or fuel avoidance, which is maybe 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So the question is, because if you gave solar operators what is true net metering, they pay retail, they can sell back for retail, then the payment plans for those solar panels would be dramatically reduced. On to agriculture here a little bit. We worked on local foods issues in Kansas for the last couple years. We had a state task force. You know, I guess what we're really trying to figure out is where to go from here at this point. We import 95% of the fruits and vegetables that you eat in your household comes from out of state at this point. It's about $770 million a year we all spend on fruits and vegetables. We only grow 32 million of that locally. So if we could get that to 100 or 200 million, how much more of those dollars would be circulating? When you look at the USDA food plate, half of that food plate is fruits and vegetables. A quarter is protein and a quarter is grains. Only 15% of Kansans come anywhere close to getting their 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. We just became the 7th highest state in the country for adult obesity. 34% of our adults in Kansas are obese, not overweight, obese at this point, anyway. There are some good news about some of this debate. Douglas County was the first county in the state to develop a local food policy council, and they've done some exciting stuff. And Lawrence has 9 community gardens around the thing, and they're developing a food hub, and it's tremendous, you know, the awareness that's happened out of Douglas County. We now have 31 counties in the state that have passed food councils. So whether, you know, the reality is that Topeka doesn't do much with agricultural policy. That the thing that drives agriculture policy way more than anything else is federal legislation, and it's primarily the Farm Bill. And our problem, and we're going to have a Farm Bill debate next year. They have to reauthorize it in 2018. Our Farm Bills subsidize 5 crops: wheat, corn, soybeans, rice, and cotton. That's where the money goes, for crop insurance and for loan payments. We don't do anything for fruits and vegetables, even though that's half of the USDA food plate at this point. How many have heard the name JBS? Does that ring a bell with anybody in this room? Happens to be the largest beef packer in the world at this point. Happens to be Brazilian. It bought IBP. It just paid billions of dollars in fines for corruption in the state of Brazil. And they're one of 4 companies that control 90% of our beef trade in our country. I'm sure everybody's heard of Smithfield Farms. That was the largest US-owned pork producer in our country, and it just got bought by the Chinese. I mean, should we care? I mean, food sovereignty, safety, you know, I mean, going forward, I think what we're going to have to do is start talking about how do we redevelop a regional infrastructure again for supplying, producing our own safe and sustainable, hopefully organic food in this country. There's a bill, I didn't know if Jerry Joseph was going to be here today, but we had a bill the last 2 years to do away with conservation easements in the state of Kansas. That county commissions could say, we have too many conservation easements in our county, we're going to put a limit on it. And the bill said that if a new owner buys a piece of property that has a conservation easement on it, they can throw it out. So that hasn't gone anywhere. Good news. We're in the middle of a debate about noxious weeds and pesticide law in the state of Kansas. That's something else Marcy could talk about and her position on ag. And I won't go too far into the weeds on all of this. The simple truth is that for 20 years we've overused Roundup Ready herbicides, glyphosate, and now we have 24 to 30 super weeds in our state and growing. And now the next game is what's the next level of toxicity in our chemical onslaught in agriculture to control that. And what USDA is proposing, what the debate in Kansas is, it will be primarily 2,4-D. And glyphosate is bad enough, but it doesn't drift too much. 2,4-D is another game, and it can drift a ways. And in our existing law, we have no definition of drift for pesticides. We have no right of a landowner to post their land as a no-spray zone. And I think we would have real problems. The county weed departments really enforce pesticide law. They're the main players. And I think their ability to spray right-of-ways and ditches and that, if it gets away from them, well, that's too bad, but I don't know how liable they would be. The other thing in agriculture that is probably pretty key is what's happening with our state water plan. And tell me if you've heard this plan before. It was passed in 1989, and we were going to have a three-legged stool to support our state water plan. A third was going to come from water fees. A third was going to come from agricultural fees, pesticides, fertilizer, and a third was going to come from our state government, state taxpayers. That was the balance. Since 2009, we have stopped with the state tax money going into the water plan. We hit about $28 million, was kind of the average amount in the water plan for 15 years. Next year it'll be 13 million. And our problems are that our reservoirs are filling up. Kansas didn't have a great place to build federal reservoirs, but they're filling up, and that's the backup, that's the supply source for drinking water for most of the urban residents in our state. And so it's tens of millions of dollars to start talking about dredging reservoirs. And we're going to have to face that. The other reality is aquifer depletion, and the Ogallala particularly. Our state issued too many water rights, 35,000. We are over pumping the Ogallala. So then the question is, we made a mistake as a state to issue so many water rights. That water is owned by the people of Kansas. How do we put the genie back in the bottle? And what people are saying is, my water right is equal to my property right. Now that's never been litigated in Kansas courts, and that would be a battle. Because if it is a property right, then we have to buy it back. So we have to buy those water rights back from those people, millions of dollars involved in that. I'm getting close to my end. It's dangerous to give a lobbyist a microphone here, but so let's talk about gun laws. You haven't heard about gun laws, have you? And as we sit, if I have this right, the gun law that was passed by the state legislature is sitting on the governor's desk. A governor has 10 days to sign it, veto it, or let it become law without his signature. Today's the 10th day. And a lot of people are speculating he's probably going to let it become law without his signature. I mean, if he vetoes it, we've got to come up with $12 million, hire 190 people at our 4 state hospitals to provide some protection. 12 million, we have or don't have at this point. Another damaging thing I think from Brownback that we're going to dig out of for a long, long time is how we've treated state employees. And when Brownback took over, there was about 43,000 state employees. We have 36,000 now. Even more decimating than the fact that we cut, and a lot of those positions weren't filled because those agencies didn't have the money to hire those people. Those people were needed. There were social workers and prison guards, and you can go down a long list. But these agencies were never funded, and especially after the recession hit in 2008 and 9. So this legislature just whacked away at vacant positions, not because nobody said we didn't need them, but we couldn't afford to fill them, so we killed them. I think more troubling beyond that is the threat we've done to classified positions in Kansas. That classified employees had some protection, that they had some place to go to talk about why were they fired, were they mishandled, how were they treated. And last few years, we have just continually done away. We've done everything we can to make all those new positions unclassified. And one of the games and the way they did it in this was, and you take the Kansas Corporation Commission that had 300 employees, they basically said to the KCC employees, we'll give you a 7% rate increase or wage increase that they hadn't had in a few years, but you have to give up your classification standing. And that wasn't the only agency that we did that in, I mean, it was an effort to kill public service. Lastly, obviously, politics in 2018. Here we go. As I said, everybody ready for Kobach, and what will he do in a low turnout Republican primary in August of 2018? Ed O'Malley's probably going to be in the game. He's a former Johnson County legislature, runs a thing called the Kansas Leadership Council down in Wichita. He would be kind of a moderate option at this point. And then on the Democratic side, we've already seen Josh Savati get into it. He was a state legislator from Ellsworth for a long time, became the Secretary of Agriculture, went on to the EPA, worked under Carl Brooks, who was a great person. And also Carl Brewer, who is the mayor of Wichita, at this point was the first to jump in to the race. And now the question is, are we going to see Jim Ward, who's the House Minority Leader, make the plunge? It's kind of what we're looking for at this point. Looks like Senator Wagle, our president of the Kansas Senate, is probably going to make a jump to run against Estes in the primary in Wichita for that congressional seat that Estes just won but has to rerun in 2018. And the other question from the Senate side is Karen Tyson going to jump into the Republican side on the 2nd Congressional District and see how that works out against, probably a head-to-head battle with Paul Davis in that race. So, we could get into some election laws and things, obviously I work for the league, I probably should cover those better than I did. I saw where Illinois passed a law recently. It's amazing for Illinois. You talk about a state, they haven't had a budget in 2 years. They have a whole Democratic legislature and they had a maverick Republican elected as governor and they haven't done anything. But they just passed a law that said when you get your vehicle registration, you're also registering to vote at the same time. So,
where is that?
In Illinois, state of Illinois. So with that diatribe and editorial comments, maybe I should give Marcy a couple times to fill in and answer a couple of my miscues, but I'd be glad to answer what questions that I could at this point. Do you want to make a couple comments?
A couple comments. Can we turn off the...
After the vote, when the Senate had approved a tax plan and the House had not, there was a little bit of discussion the next 2 days about from the Republicans, why didn't the Democrats, support this tax plan? And from the Democrats to the Republicans, it's still not enough money. And then they decided they would spend some time talking about a tax plan. So they spent the next 3 or 4 days with, those big white sheets of paper and markers and talking about what to do, and having the chair of the House committee come in and the minority member on the tax committee and propose their own plan. And one of the things that they all agreed that they wanted was restoration of the child care tax credit. So it was interesting to see some other members of the legislature get a little worried that they might find the number of votes to pass their plan. And all of a sudden, we stopped talking about a two-tier tax plan and went back to the 3 tiers, got the child care tax credit in it, and actually it's phased in along with the medical deduction and the deductions on property tax and mortgage interest. So I'm hoping that the other interest in taxes, both on internet sales, can we expand taxes to internet sales, and can we reduce taxes on food, are kept sort of as carrots if the legislature has to go back and look at taxes once again to fund schools. We also have the opportunity, I think, because the highest rate was set at 5.7, there's some feeling in the legislature that everybody wants to keep it at 6 or below, that we could look at a higher rate on the tier. But there's some sense that we may need some flexibility to come back to taxes income tax, if we need more money for schools, because no one was interested in utility taxes. And
How about raising the 20 mills?
I think that the property tax is as high as people would like to see it. There's some discussion on a 3-cent tax on gasoline. In the budget that we passed, we did allow for another $400 million in bonds just to keep up with maintenance on roads and highways, because if you don't pay for the maintenance, it's going to be more expensive. So I think we're both here to answer questions.
Yeah, we are. Here, I'll get you a chair.
Go ahead.
What would it take to put Potawatomi State Hospital into receivership so that it could be funded and administered by something other than the state government?
The legislature, I think, or the majority of the legislature is wary of privatizing.
No, not privatizing.
Well, but if you put it in charge of someone other than state government.
Now, I would put it in charge of a special master appointed by a federal district judge. And we would not privatize it. It would somehow, the state would have to be compelled to staff it and fund it, and the special master would oversee it. And not privatized, no. Mental health is the last thing that should be privatized, I would think. But I don't know how you could do that. I doubt if you could. Because we can't declare the legislature a noxious weed. So, we're not going to, but mental health needs to be taken care of.
And there is funding for another 20 beds to be opened at Osawatomie, or if that cannot be done, that money be used to provide beds in other places. There was also some additional funds for crisis mental health centers and communities, and that was an important thing because we would like people to be able to get help before they have to go to a state hospital.
Aren't community mental health centers going to get a little extra money out of the provider tax?
They are. So if you understand how a provider tax works, it's a tax that the state is charging because it needs to be paid. Hospitals can assume that that's a cost of doing business and draw down additional Medicaid matching dollars. So it's a bizarre scheme for funding that one state started and every other state is now copying.
Mr. Johnson, you did mention Lieutenant Governor Culver in the political mix. Surely he will be.
Well, that's, the speculation game that goes on under the dome is endless. You could spend a lot of time. Would Collier want to jump into a primary race against Kobach? I think we would. I think that debate is really open at this point. Does Collier have the fire in the belly in a way that Brownback and other, long-time politicians have had? He was a state senator, but I think it's questionable. We've been speculating for a year now that Brownback was going to be gone. That he didn't get the position in the Vatican. He gave that to Newt Gingrich's wife, but and then he had this food program that would have been in Rome as well that they thought he was lined up for, and that didn't happen. So I think part of the question is if he walks out of Topeka, and you talk to journalists and they say they've heard rumors of moving trucks, et cetera, then if Collier steps in and handles it for a year, the next session, does that give him a leg up? I think it's questionable.
Thank you.
You bet. Has a question? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of weed, I just moved from Colorado, and it brings in a huge amount of revenue. Is that ever discussed to fill the lab hole?
Well, the recreational or medical use, probably not. What it is finally getting a little play is the industrial hemp and the options of bringing that as a crop and, an option for that. And didn't a bill pass to deal with it? It didn't,
The House, but not
not the,
not the Senate.
at some point, how backwater will Kansas always stay at this point? And Kansas usually doesn't do things first, but you see these other states that are starting to build, an understanding of, what's involved with loosening those laws. Is Sessions going to come in and raid Colorado? Are we going to see that? There's some questions up in the air about. Is the federal law going to change, and how how you're going to list marijuana, and then beyond that, how much latitude are the states really going to get to play, given the law and order zealotry that we're seeing in D.C.
My question is, I was tremendously enlightened by that video because of the fact that it had a long perspective and we could look at the trends over time. What will the league do to try to make this information in front of people so they'll realize not just the short-term struggle, but the long-term picture that we have to deal with?
Well, I'm really pleased that that's out on YouTube, and I've started writing my sort of end of the year newsletter, and I'm going to put the link in that. And certainly the league can put that link in our next voter, and just encourage people to share it with others, because it is a great thing to see. I had one other comment I was going to get back. Paul talked about affordable housing being a really important issue. So I was very pleased during the last discussion the tax committee in the Senate was having on taxes, a motion that I made to include the rental or the homestead credit.
Property tax.
Yeah, the homestead property tax credit that still exists for homeowners, to reinstate that for renters. And that actually did pass because a couple of members were missing. Actually, one member was missing, but if we had come back to the discussion, it would have been a tie 8-8, and that's not enough to get it back off the tax plan. So all of a sudden, all the rest of the taxes were held in conference committee and not in a bill that came out of the Senate Tax Committee. But that's one way we can start to address a concern for renters who are 55 and older or have a dependent child in their household, because we do give relief for individuals who own their own homes and earn, I think, less than $34,000, that credit. We should also expand that for renters. Kansas used to do that, and it's sort of a small but easy step, I think, towards at least addressing one issue about housing.
Wasn't there some debate about putting the rebate for food sales tax to make it refundable again?
There was that in the proposal that came from what ended up as the bipartisan coalition. They also included the making that food sales tax credit refundable, so that you got it even if you didn't owe taxes, and then adding the renters. Those were both in there. It's a difficult year because we don't have a lot of money and everything costs something. But I had proposed that we do away with the low income tax exclusion and substitute the renters. The low income tax exclusion cost us about 19 million. The renters was 15 million. And you would have probably, those individuals who qualified would have gotten their food sales tax rebate if they were left with a tax liability. But again, I'm thinking we're not done with taxes.
Do you think the court is going to accept that you adequately finance public schools?
I'm more concerned about the changes we made in equity. So some of the things, we have a local option budget, and when the legislature reduced the base state aid per pupil, they knew that that was a problem for our schools, so they allowed communities to fund the same 33% on their local option budget. So they didn't reduce that amount. They used that amount as if it had been figured on the old base. Now the bill says after 2 years, both the basic state aid per pupil and that local option budget money can be increased by the cost of inflation. So that means that the local option budget would grow very slightly, but more than the base state aid per pupil. It's certainly something counties like Johnson County might want to see, but it's not providing equity. So I think there's 9 places in the bill that that effect on equity is being questioned, and I'm hoping that the courts will take a good look at those parts of the bill.
So does that mean a special session?
The courts, if the courts say you need to do something, that means a special session. They could say you need to do something in the next session, or they could say something you need to do something by this year. I think the good thing, if the governor will sign the school finance plan, districts can start planning. This is unreasonable to be this late when you've had to make contracts with teachers, when you've had to make a lot of your plans, at least if the bill goes through, I don't think the courts are going to ask us to spend less money on the schools. So they'll have a base to work with.
What needs to happen for Osawatomie State to become recertified? And why can't we do that?
Would you repeat the question?
CMS.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question is, why can not the,
State.
or can't Osawatomie be recertified? And what does the state need to do to get that? I was on the legislative tour of Osawatomie, and we saw some of the works that's been done to make it harder to commit suicide if you were a patient at Osawatomie. So replacing ceilings, making hinges that instead of you could tie a rope around 3 places, the hinge goes all the way down the door. The doorknobs are not circular anymore, but a wedge, so a rope would slip off of that. So the most interesting thing that I have heard is CMS would have allowed guns in the facility. So I am trying to get around this understanding, but CMS has to approve both the staffing and the facilities. And I'm not sure what the reluctance is, because every month we hear, oh, they're working on this and they've been talking to CMS, and we're gonna hear is
I
that.
understand that staffing is really a problem, that people don't want to work there. So do they need to raise salaries or change conditions or offer training?
They did raise salaries. And one of the problems is probably the location, that it's not close to a larger urban center. The executive branch has talked about having another entity, a private entity, run Osawatomie, and one of the things they could do was they would be hiring staff nationwide, and then you could assign staff to different places, and so maybe you work 3 years at Osawatomie and then we'll send you to California or Colorado. It would be a different way to get staff, but that is a problem and one we have to face. The community would be devastated if we pulled out. And so that's very interesting to see the senator representing that district, because she didn't vote for the budget, and so then you wonder, should we protect that location?
Actually, we have somewhat of a resident journalist expert in the room here in the back, who's written extensively on Osawatomie, and some of it's forced overtime, that, and the staffing problems. Dave Raney would be a great person to touch down with. He wrote numerous stories on the problems that they had with that and our collapsing mental health system. So,
Is there something that you can add? You have to do it on mic, though.
I just make 2 points. One is there's something going on. There's something going on. It doesn't make sense. For this to have gone on this long, it doesn't make sense. And K-Dads keep saying, well, we're talking to him, well, we're talking to him, well, we're talking to him. I go to the Mental Health Coalition meetings, which is all the advocates in the state for mental health issues, without notice. So your kid has a softball game, and it's at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and at 3 o'clock your supervisor comes to you and says, well, Jane's not coming, so you have to work tonight. That happened all the time. My point is, everybody at Osawatomie who and Darcy made the point about, small town and everybody who lives in Osawatomie who wants to work or would want to work at Osawatomie has already worked there and doesn't want to work there anymore. I'm very serious. I mean, when we closed Winfield State Hospital, at the end, only 20% of the employees lived in Winfield, okay? Because it's hard work. We as an employer are not grateful. I mean, we don't give you a pay raise. We jerk you around constantly. We have no use for your union. We dismiss you out of hand. And then we wonder why we can't get people to go to work there. I mean,
Well, didn't they put up on their website that they were considering putting it out for contract?
yeah. Oh, and that, I mean, just, as a former employee, I mean, what would it be like if you just went to Boeing or went to the Lawrence Journal World and said, hey, we're thinking about selling this, or, I mean, people start, yeah. I mean, and you're asking why don't people want to work there, and I'm telling you that's why. So, but you were asking, what are the suspicions? I mean, I would just remind you that early on, when we got decertified, and Marcy, you'd have to tell me the story, but didn't the Osawatomie legislators say that blame it on Obama? That it was CMS, is Obama, and
Because it happened right before the election, and so they were thinking we weren't protecting this.
I'm just saying it doesn't. It's a simple question. Why hasn't Osawatomie been recertified? What are the hassles? What are the problems? And you can't, I mean, as a former reporter, you can't get a straight answer. And as a legislator, I don't think you've gotten a straight answer.
The legislature is not, and I know that the Senate Ways and Means Committee chairman has been asking. And that's why she put in that if this 20 million cannot be used at that location, it will be used.
Okay.
Carol, did you have a question?
Not related to Osawatomie.
Okay, go.
Yeah.
Change the subject.
Do we see potential for increase in state aid to universities to help offset the ever-increasing student liability for tuition? Tuition at our Regents institutions has increased for in-state students by 5 times since the 1990s when my kids went to school. So if there may have been a 25% reduction over a period of time in state aid, but what the students are paying is 5 times more.
Well, and I think that, Paul talked about how they've made up for some of the loss in funding, in state funding, with tuition. So there's not a way to make anything up until we get more revenue. We can hope that this new tax plan will assure citizens that this is a great state to invest in, because I think people were really questioning what's going to happen to our schools, what's going to happen to our roads, what's going to happen to the state. But again, we haven't fully asked for all the money we had been collecting. So there's a lot of places that there's not funding for. And the first place it's going to go in education is going to be through, or 2K through 12, because the courts are demanding that. The good news about the Gannon decision is that it's not just about money. It's about programs that will help kids. And it doesn't have to be spent just at the school. So it's possible to invest in early childhood education and have that count. And we know that that's one of the programs that really works. It's possible to invest in school breakfast and school lunch programs and after-school programs, if you can show that those are going to be helping kids. But if you're not fed and you're not eating your half a plate of fruit and vegetables, then you are going to have trouble learning. So the good news about that decision, it says look at everything that may impact how these kids are doing in school, and not just those things that happen in school.
Final questions here?
A couple of years ago, I believe there were rumors that somebody in Wichita, of all places, was starting a petition to recall Brownback. And I thought, well, here in all of these liberal leftist People's Republic of Lawrence, somebody's going to start a petition. And I kept waiting, and in fact, I thought maybe about starting one, but it never got off the ground, and that always quite surprised me, particularly here in the People's Republic of Lawrence. I thought that would surely happen. Is that such an onerous and burdensome process that it can't happen?
I think you have to have a legal reason to be able to do it. And we may not like what Brownback has done, but thus far I don't think it rises to the test of something you could petition as that.
No, and I don't know what the numbers are. I'm sure it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that you would have to get on a statewide basis, and so many by congressional district and that, you know. The really missed opportunity was his reelection in 14, and two factors really played into that. One, the moderates. If Johnson County would have turned out in 2014 like they did in 2016 to change the legislature and bring certain people into play, that would have made all the difference. Because Brownback only won by 44,000 votes. The other player that really stayed at home was Wyandotte County. That there were a lot of Democrats that didn't vote, you know. If we'd had anything like normal participation, you know. And you get into questions, you know, how magnetic is Paul Davis, and, you know, how well does he reach out and, you know, and inspire, you know, other folks, and, you know, that's a whole other question, but that was the missed opportunity. Was because Davis had enough money. I mean, the funding thing. The other thing Davis didn't do was go particularly negative. That he didn't take Brownback on with some of these experiments that we're all suffering through at this point. We knew this collateral damage was happening in 2014, and so it's going to take us. You know, Marcy's absolutely right. I mean, this tax bill helps, but it ain't going to solve everything, and I think we're going to have to be looking at some other choices. I think there should be a gas tax increase, you know. And I don't know if the mill levy needs, you know, our school mill levy was 35 mills in 1996. It's 20 mills now. We still have 20,000 residential property excluded, so that helps and makes it somewhat less regressive, but that's 30 million for every mill that you raise. At this point. So, I mean, you know, I'm hoping that we can all do it with income taxes, but I'm not holding my breath that we're not going to have to dip into some other sources, you know, to find an adequate package.
I'll just make one last comment, then I'll shut up. It seems that, like back in the days of docking, the Democrats had Norbert Dreiling. And it seems that the Democrats, whether they're all on pod or what, I don't know, but they don't have a Norbert Dreiling to really drive the politics. And I think the Democrats could really use someone like that.
Okay, we are at a League of Women Voters meeting, and we want to
Sorry.
be as much as possible talking about sort of the issues. Paul just reminded me in his comment about property taxes that one of the more interesting things that was in the school finance bill from as it left the Senate, but not after the conference committee, didn't stay in. But that was to say that cities and counties could not exempt the 20 mills of property tax for IRBs and I think EBX funding. So it's interesting to say this is state money. It should come on all property to the state. And even though economic development is important, this has got to be a state decision about the funding. So I look to see that come back.
Oh, one last question. I don't have any place to go particularly,
Oh.
so, and we've worn out our video thing here, but go ahead, ma'am.
If there's so many hospitals in danger of closing, which would also devastate the communities, how are the legislators and the governor justifying not expanding Medicaid? How can they, what are they saying about that?
Well, the majority of legislators in both the House and Senate voted to expand Medicaid. I don't know what the vote would have been in the Senate. It fell short just 3 votes in the House, which is not very many. You know, I think they're saying, oh, you know, look at what's happening at the federal level. We think that there's going to be a change. Do we want to do something now if we can't count on it? And you have to remember, we're all pretty well insulated. We work in a very nice place. We are taken care of. And it's hard to understand, if you're doing okay, how some of these things are really affecting everyone else. And if it's not your community, you know, if you are from a larger metropolitan area, you're not faced with that decision. And if you're from a small community, you probably talked more about guns than you did about hospitals.